at the Topchubashov Center, a Baku-based think tank in Azerbaijan. I'll be moderating today's webinar entitled EU's New Black Sea Strategy and Changing Geopolitics of the Eastern Neighborhood. In this discussion, I'll be joined by two esteemed, valuable experts, analysts, Samuel Devry Westerby. He is Managing Director of the European Council, European Neighborhood Council. He specialized on Turkey, Central Asia, and the Middle East. His research is focused on EU-MENA relations, Turkish politics, energy, migration, and regional neighborhood policy. And Velina Zakharova is a geopolitical strategist and founder of FACE for a Conscious Experience. She previously served as director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. To note, this discussion will be recorded and you can ask your questions in the question column. So, well, the strategy paper we'll be talking about today was adopted by the EU on May 28 this year. Just a side note, although we have this, it's called a strategy, but in the official name, it's not called a strategy. It's just European Union's strategic approach to the Black Sea region. I think it makes a big difference, but in the official narrative, EU is still using this European Black Sea strategy term. So far, reactions to the document at the expert and analytical circles have been quite mixed. Some people argue that it's a significant departure from the EU's previously lackluster approach to the Black Sea region and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and now Trump administration's increasingly transactional approach to transatlantic ties and partnership pushed the European Union to be more actively committed to the Black Sea region. Others argue that despite the fanfare around the document, it lacks strategic foresight, and we may see a new version of kind of expectation capabilities gap in the EU's approach to the Eastern neighborhood. Well, without much ado, I'd like to start with my first question to Samuel. Samuel, my first question is, as taking into account that we didn't have previously Black Sea strategy from the EU, what was your first impression on that? And additionally, how sustainable do you think the EU's shift toward a Black Sea region is covered in this document?
Okay, so I just want to make as a disclaimer, I mean, I come very much from an approach of looking at Turkey and Caucasus, Balkans, and Central Asia. So forgive me if there are components that I miss in the analytical nature of what I will say and so on. So from my daily workload and the things we work with at the European Neighborhood Council, it was very much expected and necessary that the EU took a more kind of like proactive approach with regards to the Black Sea, and that is because when we look over the last few years, I mean, first of all, what's happened is that there's been the war on the EU's doorstep, and when you look at the literal states of the Black Sea, and we often have a tendency to of course think about the Russia threat from the Baltics. We have a tendency to think about it from Poland. There's a lot of noise from the council. Foreign Affairs Council from these countries, and rightly so. They have a very difficult history with regards to Russia and so forth, and of course also the Nordics have been very vocal with regards to the Russia threat, and 100% rightly so. And where we sometimes have heard a little bit less from has been in the Black Sea. And when I talk about literal states of the Black Sea, both EU and non-EU literal states of the Black Sea, some of them, of course, have some business ties to Russia on the eastern side of the Black Sea. So sometimes they've been a little bit less vocal and they've been more kind of subdued. Even Caspian, on the Caspian side, you also find this with Azerbaijan and with the Central Asian countries. But behind the veneer of diplomacy and behind the nice words and all these niceties, there are lots of concerns. And so same thing very much applies on the EU side. Bulgaria, Vilina's country, or partly Vilina's country, I think, and also Romania, as well as candidate country Turkey, have been very concerned with essentially with the militarization of the Black Sea. What we've seen is when you look at CIPRI or other types of data with regard to militarization of the Black Sea, you see that the two countries at war obviously have militarized hugely. And that's, of course, the arms race that everyone else becomes very concerned with. So with regards to having an EU Black Sea security strategy or paper, it was very much about time. It is an absolutely expected strategy, and it's a strategy that's not only necessary for the EU, but also for the littoral states who, of course, see Russia as a threat.
Yeah, definitely. But can you delve a bit more on that about we had this 2014 Russia's annexation of Crimea, occupation of Donbass, and later where we saw that both NATO and EU reinforced their eastern flank along the Russian borders, both in the Baltic and the Black Sea countries like Romania and Bulgaria. Now, but later we saw some kind of modus vivendi with Russia. And then now, after 2022, we see some kind of similar scenarios going on. But now, unprecedentedly, the EU comes up with a new Black Sea strategy because this time the threat emanating from Russia is comparably way higher. Yeah. So my question is, can it be? I mean, when you read this document, do you see that it's like calculated for a longer term engagement and commitment rather than a short term adaptation or reaction to Russia's aggression?
Okay, so that's another question in itself. So first of all, there's a problem when you think when we talk about the militarization of the Black Sea, the Montreux Treaty is of utmost importance, and it's a little bit difficult to go around that because it serves some special purposes and has some very special rules, and it's not so easy for NATO just to change that dynamic, partly because one of the country that essentially controls the straits is Turkey, so second largest army in NATO, but also because there's different kind of there are different ambitions within the Black Sea with regards to maintaining the Montreux Treaty and maintaining the balance, essentially militarization balance inside. That said, what this Black Sea strategy now tries to do is, because it cannot engage, of course, it cannot counter militaristically as much as maybe some would want. I'm sure the US would be more interested in that and so forth, but it's not really possible because of the constraints of the Montreux Treaty. So what it instead does, when you read through the document, it tries to pull on lots of other levers instead. So it pulls on common maritime agenda, on solidarity lanes, on the Black Sea synergy, speaks of culture, education. It talks about cooperation in defense industries, resilience, trade is a huge component. It even goes into like energy and decarbonization. Essentially, it tries to tackle everything else from essentially what you would call a hybrid format in order to counter what is happening in this region and which is definitely a danger to everyone. So that's interesting. So I guess you can say, you can look at it from a hybrid point. It's a hybrid document of sorts because you cannot approach it in the traditional militaristic way because of Montreux and because of some limitation that exists there. With regards to the longevity, long-term component of the document and of the strategy, I think, I think the most long-term is perhaps infrastructural and energy investments. So it's not exactly in the document, but it allures, and I know for a fact that in the policy of the EU, it goes hand in hand. There are infrastructural projects under Global Gateway towards the east, both as part of let's say Global Gateway East or Middle Corridor, Trans-Caspian Corridor. But it's not only that; it's also much more than that. It's also investments into Turkey and also into the actual Black Sea. I'm talking about energy cables and data cables. Everything from energy and data to transportation hubs, so like warehouses, transmissions, harbors, these kind of things, GOGs between trains, all these kind of things, like there are priority investment, both public and private, that are going into this at the moment. And I think that is definitely a more durable way of looking at not only the Black Sea strategy, but the Black Sea strategy as part of a larger, we can call it Trans-Caspian or Eastern strategy of the EU, that definitely ranges across 2 seas or even 3, Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Central Asian, Caspian Sea.
Definitely. There are a lot of geopolitical variables also there. So, Velina, my question to you is, before 2022 invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we had some kind of a bipolar system in the so-called shared neighborhood or common neighborhood, you call it, between Russia and the European Union. Yeah, between these Eastern Partnership countries, 6 of them were divided between, some of them were signing association agreement with the EU, some were in the Russian Eurasian Economic Union, and Azerbaijan was the only country kind of in between. So, but after the 2020 invasion, we see the region, the Black Sea, the wider Black Sea region has become more crowded, multipolar. Yeah, there are now more increasing engagement of China in Chinese presence in the Black Sea region. Again, wider Black Sea region. We have Turkey, we have even Iran, India, and some other Japan. So, how do you think this document, this Black Sea strategy, help the EU navigate its ability to compete in such a crowded space? Because I mean, in terms of EU being a geopolitical power rather than a normative power, previously we know it.
Thank you very much for this invitation and for this highly relevant question. It is going to be hard for me to really wrap up all of the insights, considering your question, into a short timed format, but let me try. First and foremost, there is no surprise that we ended up with such strategy on the Black Sea region as a continuum of initiatives and strategic papers over the last, let's say, around 20 years. So if you take a look at regional initiatives, if you take a look at the development of the Eastern Neighborhood Policy, later the Eastern Partnership Program, launched 2009 as a reaction to Georgia war, and later also the deviation of the neighborhood policy, the split between Southern and Eastern, definitely with the 2014 milestone. I mean, the next aggression wave by Russia, and now ending in this strategic document called Black Sea strategy. There is no surprise to me that, let's say, there is a need to reflect on what's going on in both hard and soft security matters, because there is obviously a nexus between the geopolitical on the one side and the geoeconomic. And second, to the geoeconomic issues. Now, the European Union in itself is not a geopolitical actor. So just by publishing a paper, a strategic paper or blatantly open about it, it doesn't make you automatically a geopolitical actor. Okay? But of course, still there is this effort, and I welcome the effort to try to identify the potential of the Black Sea members of the European Union. Some of them were mentioned, like Romania or Bulgaria. These are the so-called front countries along the eastern flank of NATO, together with Turkey, with Turkey. Of course, then we have a second tier of countries which are Eastern Partnership and now meanwhile candidate countries in the Eastern neighborhood, such as Ukraine and Moldova, and by extension, hopefully, Georgia. And then we have also further countries in the region in South Caucasus, such as Armenia, which is now activating its relations with the European Union as a reaction to the deterioration of the relationship with Russia. And then, of course, Azerbaijan, which is positioned strategically between all these kind of poles of power with its strategic non-alignment approach. So how to put this all together in a paper? Yes, of course, Samuel already outlined most of the important pillars of interests and initiatives. But let me highlight the following. First and foremost, what I would like to see happening is not just the next strategic paper. And again, I welcome this one, but what I will want to see happening is, the to-do list, the concrete deliverables in tactical manner. That means in the next 2 to 3 years. And then, of course, more importantly, in strategic context of at least 3 to 5 years. This is what I will be following on behalf of the European Union. And going back to the statement that the European Union is not a geopolitical actor, the very simple answer to that for our audience is the realization of a lack of power projection, because the power projection does not come automatically from the European Union. It comes from the European NATO members. And we can, of course, absolutely include also the most important NATO member in the region, which is Turkey, and which now is playing even more important strategic role for the European Union, given the growing role, not only in security and military terms, but also in geoeconomic terms by Russia. Okay, maybe a final point when it comes to this strategy. It's a point that I won't cover, and that's why I want to highlight it, to manage expectations. This is the third flagship, the third dimension of this paper, because this is what the European Union does. It puts everything in one pot. And here, of course, it's also about climate, about ecology, about societies, and so on. So this is something that is not part of my expertise. So if there are any questions related to the climate change initiatives that are also put in the strategic paper, and of course they are equally important, but they are not part of my expertise, I will have to, manage the expectations in advance that I won't be able to answer these questions.
Yeah, definitely. When it comes to this geopolitical EU concept, I have to say that it was now current EU Commission President von der Leyen's first, when she came to power in 2019, she said her commission will be geopolitical commission. And since then, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw that EU's first ever military assistance to Ukraine led many people to conclude that the EU is finally emerging as a geopolitical player. But as you say, it's a very questionable, let's say, discussion by many people. So returning to, taking into account that you guys are quite established, let's say, observers on Turkey, Samuel, and China, and Russia, Velina, I'll ask my second question about these two specific powers, Turkey and China, and their let's say presence and footprint, growing footprint, and on the wider Black Sea basin. So starting with you, Samuel, how do you think, on the one hand, in the last 3 years, especially in recent months, as we see that Turkey, on the one hand, has been critical to prevent Russia's naval buildup, and the Black Sea, you brought up Montreux Convention. Yeah, it was the key leverage Turkey was using against. But at the same time, we know that Turkey is against NATO's larger presence in the Black Sea. So it's kind of balancing its ties in that context. At the same time, Turkey emerged as the key regional partner for the EU to reach out to South Caucasus and Central Asia, all its well-established ties with the regional countries. So how do you think in this context, as a long-time Turkey watcher, where is Turkey in this strategy? Is it just a short-term partner that the EU is coordinating its moves in the South Caucasus and Central Asia, or or something different that I miss?
Yeah. Well, I think you can look at Turkey from many different perspectives. So in the actual document, I'm happy to also talk about like Turkey within the context beyond the document. But within the actual EU strategic Black Sea document, there's a lot of mention of Turkey. It's like continuously mentioned or multiple times mentioned throughout the document as an EU strategic partner, and it's a candidate country. It even goes into detail about customs union. So it's quite clear that the EU is very much out there to include Turkey in this strategy and to have it on board. If not, they would not mention customs union. I guarantee you that, considering the last few years of haggling and negotiation over this topic, and not every member has been always so happy. So it's a very clear sign that the EU is very inclusive and very pro-Turkey in this document. It mentions prisoner exchanges with Russia. It mentions diplomatic efforts throughout the last few years, the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So, I mean, it's very, very obvious, I would say, that Turkey is a key pillar of this strategy. And within that context, I think it's also relatively important to mention that there is a lot of mentioning of PESCO, Safe Instrument, EDIP, the European Defense Industry Program, and a lot of these kind of components of European, so to say, new security, where Turkey has been formally and informally knocking on the door for a while to be part of. So I'm also sure that you can easily interpret this document as one step closer towards EU Turkey security cooperation, even defense cooperation, I think, at least in this sector and in this area. Then beyond the document, I think it's important to mention, of course, number one, Turkey is a candidate country. So whenever you do anything on a region like a Black Sea or any kind of neighboring component of foreign policy, it's kind of unavoidable that a literal state that's also a candidate country is not mentioned, number one. Then number two, it's also important to mention that, and coming back to the discussions before, is that the EU has been focalizing for the past few years on a new strategically autonomous corridor. It's only one amongst many corridors. It's one amongst Africa corridor, Atlantic corridors, IMEC corridor, you name it. But one of them, what do you call it, also development road corridor, they're all to various degrees prioritized by the EU. But in the last few years, this new corridor has popped up, which was unknown previously, to be frank, and which is the middle corridor, the Trans-Caspian corridor, and it's been receiving this huge amount of attention. A lot of money is pouring into it as well through EBRD. And so obviously, when we look at the Black Sea, Turkey is one of the two bifurcations of this corridor. So one part of the sub-corridor goes through the Black Sea itself, and I think we can talk about the relevance of that within the context of infrastructure maybe and other things. Happy to answer any questions on that if that's of interest. And then separately, the sub-corridor also goes through Turkey, the land route, let's say one of the options which already exists and is ongoing. So within that context, of course, Turkey is important, both from an accession perspective, clearly within the document itself, within the strategy, as well as within the context of the Central Asia, Trans-Caspian, and Eastern neighborhood strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And what about China, Velina? How do you think? I mean, actually, I'd like you to talk a little about your dragon beer concept, which I like very much. That how it operates in the Black Sea, how Russia-China coordination, to challenge, let's say, the Western dominance and how it plays out in the Black Sea. And actually, there are many people I see who argue that China actually may be helpful for some wider Black Sea region countries who want to balance Russia. Especially, for example, in the case of Georgia, many people argue that maybe not giving the port, Anaklia port to EU, but to China, it can help to Russia's protests or, Russia would avoid preventing the realization that corridor. I saw that China is interested in buying some, maybe at least operating some ports in the Romania. Of course, it's a quite delicate matter, but they show their interest. So how do you think China's growing footprint in the Black Sea and how it evolves in this broader context of adoption of this strategy paper?
Okay, so first, let me just give you a very short definition of what the dragon bear really is, because there has been a lot of misunderstanding about this concept. Basically, it means strategic coordination between China and Russia in all systemically relevant domains. Full stop. It's only one sentence. In all systemically relevant domains. So you can start from commodities and move to economy and trade, and then pick, of course, selectively sectors which have also, as you know, for countries like Russia and China, strategic importance. For instance, critical infrastructure or agriculture, and then you can end in domains such as the technological military domain, the defense capabilities, and meanwhile also space exploration. So you pick all the systemically relevant domains, you will find by all definitions, you will find the clear trend of exponential growth of strategic coordination over a time span of the last 10 years. Okay, so that's it. Now, how does this reflect the realities on the ground in the Black Sea? Now, first and foremost, maybe let me start from the broader region, which goes to the, beyond the Black Sea region to the Central Asian terrain, to the wide Eurasian landmass. And here we had the main thesis shared by the majority of experts, academia, both academia and practitioners, that Russia and China would never come closer because of the conflictual interests in Central Asia. And as we see, there is meanwhile a sort of acception of realities given the large geo-economic portfolio of China in Central Asia. And there is an exception of reality on behalf of Russia, and there is a sort of a split of roles where Russia takes care of the security and the geopolitical dimension, where, and China takes care of the business, the financial portfolio. Okay, so now going back to Black Sea, you clearly see that there is this urge on behalf of the European Union to react to this growing portfolio on behalf of China, because China used the old Soviet playbook of penetrating the soft belly of Europe, using countries which were belonging to the former Soviet bloc because of the lack of strong institutions or lack of strong political landscape or whatever, pick whatever variable you like. There was it was much easier to penetrate these countries and to start actually a slow but steady infiltration through the geoeconomic dimension. That was the Chinese approach, and still is the Chinese approach, to create a very positive propaganda, of course, on behalf of China when it comes to Chinese activities. Think of for instance, the pandemic phase. And the Russian approach to this region has remained the same for the last 30 years, including now the hard security part, where the masks are off and Russia is playing the long game. Russia is by definition right now showing its true intentions about the Black Sea region, because Russia's geopolitical axis of vertical one, starting from the Arctic and moving along the whole eastern flank of NATO, which is the western flank of Russia, and then, of course, moving through Black Sea and obviously Eastern Mediterranean, connecting to the MENA region, and then trying to find the strategic access to the Indian Ocean via eastern littorals of Africa. So just to give you an image of what Russia is doing. So once again, you clearly see that there is a horizontal expansion on behalf of China via mostly terrestrial connectivity. The middle corridor was mentioned, which is very important for China, especially now that the Russian deviation of the connectivity doesn't work because it has been blocked since 2022. And then there are, of course, also the maritime connectivities, where China has built different corridors to connect itself also to maritime routes in order to make sure that in any case of a blockade of commodities via the Indo-Pacific line, which is still very much controlled and secured by the United States with some partners, that there will be alternatives for China. Now, going back to the Black Sea region, you clearly see there is a growing portfolio. The European Union is feeling the pressure to react to that. That is why the Global Gateway was launched as a counter initiative to the BRI initiative of China to present a counter approach that is amounting to 300 billion altogether. Let's say 150 billion, because 150 was immediately reserved for the African portfolio, but in general 115 billion as a reaction to the BRI. Then there was, of course, the political reaction to initiatives like the originally 16+1 initiative by China, which then turned to 17+1. Then it became 14+1. So there is a political dimension, there is a geoeconomic dimension, and then there is, of course, the security dimension. Think of initiatives like the launch of, for instance, or the use of 5G Huawei systems or any other Chinese infrastructure. So you have these different dimensions. And then you have different layers where Russia and China are just overlapping themselves. They are not contradicting themselves in this region. And clearly, when I said the masks are off, I mean also the statements by just recently, in preparation of the pretty much failed European Union-China summit, when the Chinese foreign minister finally admitted that China has no interest if Russia loses the war in Ukraine because it keeps the West busy on the old continent. So you get the idea of the dragon bear. It's a two-front scenario in which the Americans are overstretched. They have to, on the one side, they have to support the Europeans and by extension Ukraine in this war against Russia. It's a hybrid war, which Russia is waging against the European security order. It wants the security order to be over, and this is also in the interest of China. And at the same time, the second front of this war, the bigger one, is the Indo-Pacific. All of this is interconnected. And if you take a look at not just at the map, but if you take a look at the global context, you clearly see that one of the most important nexuses is actually the Black Sea, that sees the intersection of all of these hotspots and connectivities and corridors, the whole scramble of corridors in itself. So basically, I think that right now, this is probably and it was already mentioned as an inflection point, but clearly the manifestation of an inflection point when it comes to geopolitics in Black Sea in the 21st century.
Yeah, definitely. We have already covered quite geopolitical and security aspects. Now I want to delve into pillars security, connectivity, and as you said, climate and resilience. And the first component, security, there are some unprecedented steps. However suspicious you may seem now, there that Samuel, I want to ask you about this Black Sea Maritime Security Hub concept the document discusses. It's about early warning systems, some kind of establishing early warning systems. And at the same time, it's about the protection of critical maritime infrastructure, taking into account that, as you talked about, the middle corridor and undersea electricity cables and what Russia has been doing to critical infrastructure in different parts of Europe, let's say in the Baltics and other places. So how do you think this Black Sea Maritime Security Hub, is this primarily a deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, like to increase the security resilience of these countries that Russia would not, let's say, challenge their security in the future, or just a reaction to critical infrastructure protection across the Black Sea?
It's the latter. So it's not, for anything that, so in the document, well, okay, let's start with outside of the document. So anything in real, let's say, hard security terms is covered by NATO. And I think will continue being covered by NATO. Maybe in the future, once, if there will be a European branch of NATO or European defense that becomes stronger, then maybe it will be a different story at that time. But for the time being, it's definitely NATO. Anything that covers traditional military defense, deterrence, etc. Of course, nuclear and whatnot. In this case, however, in the document, it's referring, as I mentioned before, to the latter. So it is exactly about infrastructure. And there are several reasons for that. If we look at the document itself, it mentions on numerous occasions monitoring of critical maritime infrastructure. It mentions, I'm reading here, submarine cables, offshore installations, gas and wind energy operations. It specifically says off the coast of Bulgaria and Romania, related maritime capabilities, unmanned remote piloted vessels, surveillance drones, and so forth. So it's very clearly that this Black Sea Maritime Security Hub is about protection of critical infrastructure. And beyond the fact that it mentions that, as I just read out, it of course fits very much in line with the strategies we've just been talking about. So coming back to both what Velina mentioned, Global Gateway is, of course, global, as the name says, and there are 300 billion that are dedicated towards it. Those figures are, a bit flimsy, but the Commission comes out with big figures. But then when we look at what EBRD and EIB is promising under Global Gateway, we start getting a better approximation of what is being pledged at these investors forums. I only know the investors forums linked to Türkiye, Caucasus, and Central Asia, but there's also an investors forum that is specifically on infrastructure. So just to be clear, Global Gateway does not only cover infrastructure, it also covers renewable energy, it covers digital, it covers a whole range of different subjects. But let's say infrastructure is always the most important one at the beginning of a corridor, at least, because you can't really do any of the corridor stuff, whether it's an energy, a transmission of gas or a transmission of electricity, or whether it's a signal you want to transmit or a good or a service through a signal. Let's say, if we're doing this, then you need infrastructure, right? So an important component of that is infrastructure. And within the context of the Black Sea, there are priority projects by the EU that fall under the wider Global Gateway and then fall under the subcategory of the middle or Trans-Caspian corridors that are subdivided between Black Sea and Türkiye. And of course, I can say that the reason why there are these two corridors, because one could equally argue the other way, or why don't you send everything through Turkey? It is admittedly cheaper at the end of the day, and you'll have less mines and less problems with the Russians and the Ukrainians and whatnot. But of course, whenever you have a corridor for any geopoliticians, you want to hedge, because one day you have a conflict or a breakdown or attack of critical infrastructure in one place, you'd like to be able to divert some to the other way. So actually, and this is a discussion I've had with a lot of diplomats who sometimes have been a bit fiery about this, why don't we only have one corridor instead of two? What's the point? Well, actually, if you look at EBRD investors, they're more interested in having two corridors as opposed to one. So actually, for the ones who benefit from the Trans-Caspian corridor, they should be very much promoting the two-sided corridor, because they will incentivize it to grow faster and get more investment, I think. Anyway, but that's a bit beside the point. The point is, of course, that this Black Sea Maritime Security Hub covers electricity and data cables, some of which are under prospection and impact assessment at the moment. And also last year, there was a big Italian company that did most of that. And also harbors and many other critical infrastructure installations that are needed for infrastructural passage, right? So it's pretty much everything at the end of the day, and so that is very much directed towards that. Indeed, I hope that answers your question. I went up a bit of deviated on some tangents. My apologies.
Yeah, the other component of the security part, I mean, very interesting for me is the document says the strategy will facilitate dual-use infrastructure projects in the EU member states, and also connecting neighboring countries to the EU in land, sea, and air domains. I mean, the concept of dual infrastructure, I remember it first came to agenda after 2014 annexation again. At that time, there were, in 2016 NATO summit, there were this suggestion that they should establish NATO Schengen in case of a sudden Russian attack. Will the EU or NATO will be able to react to that invasion? Let's see in the Baltic countries. So the same we see in this document. Velina, I would kindly ask you about your thought about, especially in the latest NATO summit, we saw that 5% pledge, minimum GDP. So as far as I remember, 3.5% of that was about military capabilities, but 1.5% was about infrastructure. That was about dual infrastructure, that the first military convoys should be able to easily move, and then we can also think about trade connectivity. So how do you think, how feasible is this in the case of the EU, taking into account that EU is not a military bloc? So but in the strategy paper, it openly says that we are aiming to establish a dual-use infrastructure without having military capabilities. I don't know if I'm not over-exaggerating.
No, you're not over-exaggerating. It's you're just pointing to a reality, and the reality is as follows. First and foremost, it very much depends on which thesis you are operating. I think that nobody wants to openly admit what kind of context we are facing. If you ask me, if you ask about my strategic assessment, I would say, simply put, this is a global, and in this case, in this particular region, also regional context of a Cold War 2.0 between the West on the one side, or if you like, NATO on the one side as the defense alliance of the United States and the European NATO members, and China and Russia on the other side, because Russia has sided with China ahead of the decision to start a full-scale war on Ukraine. And China, in hindsight, has also sided with Russia and decided to strategically support Russia to not lose the war. Okay? That is my strategic assessment. Now, if we put this decision to invest in dual-use infrastructure, because what is dual-use? It basically means we lack the infrastructure to move the military equipment along the eastern flank of NATO. Basically, most of it is in the Black Sea area. So if we have the second largest NATO army in Turkey, and if we have a situation in which we have to act accordingly, now we have also new NATO members in the north, we cannot connect the north with the south. Because if you try to travel through these, NATO countries in the Black Sea region, you will find out that there is not enough physical infrastructure to do so. For civilians, so for businesses, okay? And here we have the first important point, dual use, meaning that we will increase the defense spending, but automatically we will also invest part of this spending for physical infrastructure. In fact, I've read today in Financial Times that the European Union wants to invest 17 billion for physical infrastructure to build transport networks exactly in this region, okay? This is what it meant. This is what it's meant. It's meant that we have to smartly combine investments in defense capabilities that we lack. But while we do so, we also need to keep in mind that we need the physical infrastructure, and on top of that, the digital infrastructure and the energy-related one for these whole systems, defense systems and technological military complex to function. So we have to work on both. That is the dual use, I think, which is, or let's say this is the translation of what is meant by this dual use. Of course, you won't hear from any political stakeholder that we are in a Cold War 2.0, that's for sure. Nobody wants to admit to reality, because it means also that once you admit to this reality, you have to act accordingly. That is why I argue that all of these series of actions and initiatives and measures that are happening too slowly. It's 2025 and we have Black Sea strategy, whereas the war started in the situation of a war, not only when it comes to Ukraine, but when it comes to the whole region.
Yeah, definitely. Samuel, you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to add. I wanted to add to this concept of dual use. You always hear dual use when it comes to chips or microchips and things like this, precisely in the same way, consumer good and as a military component. I think in this document it's quite interesting, adding on to what Velina just mentioned, this idea of upgrading transport infrastructure and what Velina mentioned with regard to 17 billion. When you look at the last investors forum, what is it now? Is it a year and a half ago? Yeah, something like that. Year and a half ago, the investors forum in Brussels. I was there with all
10 billion.
Exactly, it was 10 billion, and that money is dispersed now. I mean, everyone knows it goes into the Kazakh central bank, goes into the Tajik central bank, it goes into hydroelectricity, it goes into a whole range of different things, and it especially goes into infrastructure and transport. And I mean, I was at the Munich. Oh no, wait, it's not Munich. It was I forget now. But the biggest infrastructure conference of Europe, I think, it's definitely of Europe, in Germany. A month ago, and I was there with the different European logistics companies, Rhenus Logistics and the French ones, and they're all there. And we're talking to the Kazakh transport minister was there. The German deputy transport minister was with us. And it was very exciting. It was really crazy to see how much both money and how much dedication both private and public sector is pouring into these types of infrastructure. And what I wanted to say with regards to the dual use is that in those discussions, it was quite clear. It was quite clear that I have to be careful how I phrase this. It was quite clear that that even though they are mainly looking at the private sector component, there was an undercurrent of understanding that infrastructure and transport serves as security and critical infrastructure as well. So I thought that was just important as an anecdotal example to mention in this context as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'll actually continue with you about more specifically about the second component, which is connectivity. And but before that, I'd kindly welcome our viewers to ask questions, so we can later address. And now, the document says calls for the creation of this connectivity agenda with the EU and the regional neighborhood countries, which will be aligned with the European and Trans-European Transport Networks, TENT. And it also calls for integrating the middle corridor to the broader Rhine-Danube corridor. So my question is, can you tell us what kind of hard and soft infrastructure assistance can the EU make to realize that ambitions, let's say, that goals, so that this corridor can let's say, much better compete with the Russian route? Because, as you know, there are a lot of soft and hard infrastructure deficiencies now. There are a lot of talk, but when it comes to practice, as you said, all those conferences and stuff, discussions, there are still, lagging behind. And despite the Russian railways being sidelined now, it's still operating, we know, and some of the cargo from China to EU still moving along the northern corridor. So it's still competing, I mean. So how do you think this middle corridor, Rhine-Danube corridor combination, joining would work by the EU assistance, like targeted investments in hard and soft infrastructure initiatives?
Okay, so here there's a public side to it, and there's a private side to it. So the private side will, from my knowledge, I go to all the members of the European logistics company meet, or companies meet more or less every month, every 2 months in Brussels. I'm always kindly invited to attend them, and I can see the difference over the last years, essentially. And first of all, what they all say is, if there is no public push, private sector is unlikely to carry the brunt and the risk of establishing a new corridor. In fact, they won't, realistically. If they're, you think about their paths available, and the companies will fluctuate between them depending on price, risk, insurance, etc., etc. Establishing a new corridor necessitates a huge public input. Up until 2022, so the year of the war in Ukraine, that was absolutely not the case for Central Asia, for Caspian Middle Corridor and whatnot. Then, after the war in Ukraine, it was obvious to everyone in the logistics sector that container prices became increasingly unbearable in terms of price, not only because of the war in Ukraine, also because of protectionism, tariffs, also very much because of some of the security problems that we're witnessing on sea lanes, COVID, etc. But of course, the war in Ukraine had a huge impetus on it, and a geopolitical factor as well. And so then what happened is that, of course, EU member countries immediately started thinking, how can we deviate some of this cargo, these goods, away from both a sanctioned North Corridor, but also an increasingly risky maritime corridors, right? Going around the Horn of Africa took, about 3 weeks more, much higher price, of course, for container ships. Gulf of Aden is a problem. Again, the story goes on. And so what they then did is, first they commissioned a study, a very important study, by the EBRD. So the European Commission commissioned the study, and it's an impact assessment, which essentially shows that the assessed TEU capability by 2040 across the middle corridor, across the Trans-Caspian corridor, is somewhere around, I forget the exact number, but I think 865,000 TEU.
Yeah.
And so at the time that this was commissioned, just to be clear for everyone, the middle corridor or Trans-Caspian corridor TEU was at 20,000 or maybe 30,000, fluctuating around there, very low. Since then, this document has come out by the EBRD, which is essentially now regarded as a roadmap by every single public official and investor I've met. So everyone's on the same page. There's hard infrastructural reforms that need to be made and soft infrastructural reforms that need to be made. Hard infrastructural reforms are like, construction in the port of Alat, outside of Baku, for example, or as I mentioned before, the GOGs between the Georgian trains and the Turkish trains. Yeah. One runs on Soviet GOGs, one runs on, let's say, the European Western Standard, the Turkish one. There are many examples of highways, blah, blah. That's the hard infrastructural one. And then there's the soft infrastructural ones are like combating corruption, or like just having easier paperwork, or even being able to cross, like a peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, would be necessary. And the list goes on like that. And so this guiding document then led to the first investors forum where, Mahamat, you just mentioned, 10 billion correctly were invested in low interest loans by the EBRD, plus a huge amount of millions, I don't remember the exact number, but very large amount by the European Commission, especially by IMPA. Then there was a summit, so that money was dispersed. Projects are ongoing in the region, and the TEU went up Trans-Caspian from 30,000 to its maximum capacity now, which is about 100,000, even a bit more. So it rose fivefold, essentially. So just to see how pertinent it is. But it's reached its maximum capacity, and it necessitates that the current investment is finalized and that there's, of course, peace in the Caucasus. Yeah. And also that some laws are changed and more digital paperwork, things like this. But essentially, the trajectory is relatively positive, I would say. And so now we had the summit in Uzbekistan where Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, the president of the Commission and the EU, or the Council, sorry, met together with all the Central Asian presidents and pledged another 12 billion. Mm-hmm. And so that's the Investors Forum that's coming up this autumn. So yeah, that makes a lot of money, and it makes a pretty important trajectory, I think.
Yeah, definitely. On that regard, all go through the Global Gateway project. And Evelina, actually, I want to ask you about this competition, let's say, between the Global Gateway, because in the beginning, in 2015, there was this coordination platform between China and the EU. This Trans-Caspian corridor, the middle corridor, was kind of a complementary. Both sides were supporting it, kind of. It was a cooperative initiative. But then after 2021, Global Gateway was launched, and after 2022, the EU-China relations became more strained, and now EU openly. I remember in EU Central Asia Summit in Samarkand, Ms. von der Leyen openly said that a global gateway should be chosen over the BRI because it's more reliable and trusted. We are trusted partners to you. So right now, they are quite competitors. At the same time, the EU is proposing this Trans-Caspian corridor as the key link to gain access to Central Asia's critical raw materials, which is now for the EU is weaponized by China. So in this context, how do you think this growing competition, you also brought up this latest China-EU summit in Beijing, which was not quite, I think, desirable outcomes there. So how this growing competition between these two giant projects put these countries in between? Yeah, how do they maneuver, and what kind of implications does this competition have for them?
Again, so that I'm not misunderstood, because it very much depends on your working thesis. I mean, if you are operating with a working thesis that we are in a multipolar global order, everybody is allowed to do whatever they like, and they can launch whatever kind of initiatives and try to build the connectivity or launch economic corridors, and everybody is happy. I'm fine with it. I just don't agree with this thesis, okay? And I'm trying to convey to you that we are already in a situation of a big scramble for connectivity and a big scramble of competing geoeconomic and geopolitical corridors and initiatives. Right now, we are discussing only the topic of geoeconomics. So it's not just the BRI, and it's not just the global gateway, and it's not just the middle corridor, or let's say the Chinese middle corridor. That is the middle terrestrial connectivity as part of the bigger Eurasian land mass connectivity on top of the maritime connectivity, because as we speak, we have also other competing projects that are transpassing the Black Sea, the South Caucasus, and the wider Central Asian terrain. Russia has meanwhile successfully launched after 20 plus years of negotiations, because of the necessity of the war, the international North-South transport corridor, and it actually goes through the South Caucasus and partially Central Asia. And it's a competitive connectivity project to the European Union middle corridor, okay? So the very same, you see how the very same actors in these regions are currently operating in different connectivity projects of the great powers. That's the way it is. So for a country like Azerbaijan or for a country like Turkey, the best strategy right now is to hedge by participating in all of these, competing initiatives, even when you are not having overlapping interests. Like I mentioned at the beginning, for instance, in the case of a deteriorated relationship between Azerbaijan and Russia, as one example, to mention just one example. So you have also the Northern Sea Route, which is a project by China and Russia, and which actually aims to create an alternative to the Indo-Pacific maritime trade route that connects Europe with South Asia and Southeast Asia. And once again, who is going to, let's say, be more successful in this? I think that right now the way things are is about speed, is about deliverables. Again, it's not just about announcement of initiatives or announcement of concrete goals. It's about deliverables. Who is implementing, who is really creating physical connectivity, who is facilitating digital connectivity. Then you mentioned also the topic of for instance, minerals, rare earths, because it's all interconnected. As we speak, we cannot have a geopolitical actor in the face of the European Union when you are dependent to 98% for the supply of rare earths on a competitor, on an actor that you have defined as a strategic rival in your own papers, that is China. So you clearly see how all of this is to some extent conflictual in its content, or even if you wish, it is quite contradictional in the content, in the strategic objectives, and in the implementation of these goals. Final remark, which I have been arguing that it's a big mistake. It's a big mistake. The announcement of the IMEC corridor, which in my view has been one of probably biggest geoeconomic successes in 2023, connecting India with the Gulf states and Israel, and then, of course, through maritime connectivity with Europe, has bypassed Turkey. And of course, it the reaction was immediate. Namely, Turkey has launched alternative regional corridors, for instance, with Qatar and with the UAE. Now, again, we should avoid unnecessary competition, like the example I gave you, because the moment when you start actually bypassing critically important regional actors, you risk triggering the exact opposite effect, because nobody is going to sit idle and do nothing, especially when you have the ability to hedge and you have the flexibility to do more than an actor such as the European Union in this case. Yes, they might not have the financial portfolio of the European Union, but the European Union doesn't have the geopolitical flexibility because it's strategically bound to the United States. And even if you take a look at the dependencies right now in 2025, in all of the domains, from technology, from energy commodities to actually security and defense and corridors, this dependence on the US is even bigger. So final remark, because there was a question about Finland, and that goes to this question. You have to take a look at the Black Sea region also as a wider Black Sea region, because it's not going to be about East and West anymore, as we tend to look at the Cold War context from the previous Cold War. But it's going to be about connectivity between North and South. And here we have also the Northern Front. This is the Arctic front that we have to connect to the Black Sea.
Yeah, definitely. Samuel, you want to comment?
I just realized that we're 10 past 6, or so I don't want to drag it on too much, but I just had one.
Yeah.
I 100% agree with all the comments that have been made on critical raw materials. It's a crucial component, if not top 2 components of why the EU is in Central Asia and why it's investing a lot in infrastructure as well as a corridor, which again, when you take it into account with regards to the Critical Raw Materials Act, which doesn't allow you to have more than 60% mined and processed in one country. Obvious country is China that you can't have it in. And so there, because the raw material terrain is similar between China and Central Asia, you have an abundance in Central Asia as well. And so the EU is cleverly just diversifying in there, maybe kicking some cans down the road, but then their environmental issues also take into account. My question is for Velina about what you mentioned on the corridors, because you said, I 100% agree, of course, it's perfectly logical and correct, that there are also north-south corridors ongoing, and that Azerbaijan, especially Azerbaijan, but also Central Asian republics, are in the middle of those 2 north-south corridors to the east and to the west, on both sides of the Caspian. My question to you is, with your premise of the dragon bear, how does that fit into that? Because if you assume that dragon bear is a unity or an entity, then a north-south corridor should surely break that unity of China and Russia. How do you view that?
Should I respond directly to the question, or is there any further comment on your side, Samuel? Because I saw also a very interesting question.
Yeah, you can link them maybe. You too.
Reply to.
I haven't seen the questions in the chat, but I'll read them now. Sorry.
Because there is also a very important question related to Russia attempting fait accompli attack on the Baltic, and I think that this is something that probably is going to be interesting for the audience as well. Now, when it comes to connectivity, once again, if we assume that this context turns to be the correct estimation of the way how global geopolitics is going to manifest itself in, let's say, next 5-10 years. Of course, one parallel that we can use for us to understand the reality right now is the time before the beginning of the First World War. And that was a time when everybody was scrambling, great powers were scrambling for connectivity and trying to compete with each other over different corridors. At that time, railway was, the big buzzword, but right now it's not just about rail. It's also about highways, it's about digital and so on. Of course, with the big difference, and that is the difference of the possession of nuclear weapons, which is why I argue it's cold and it's not hot war. Their incentive on behalf of the three systemic players to use military means against each other in a direct confrontation is because of the possession of nuclear weapons very low. Okay, doesn't mean that the risk is not there. The risk is imminent, but there is a low probability of hot war between China, United States, and Russia. So in that context, to me, it makes perfect sense that you have different kind of corridors. Again, because as I explained, Russia has a vertical expansion of geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. It has to connect itself from the Arctic along the western flank of its own, armed forces and power projection in the Black Sea region. So from the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and then moving along, as I already explained, up until the eastern littorals of Africa. So that is the purpose of the North-South transport corridor. It's not detrimental to the interests of the BRI, of the Chinese project. Here again, as probably I had to explain right from the beginning, of course, the relationship between China and Russia, even though that the two leaders are pointing to equality, is highly asymmetrical. So of course, in this case, China operates with the global geoeconomic clout. The BRI is one of, is entailing many different projects in every corner of the world, on every continent. China is trade partner number one of most of the countries around the world. Okay, so it's a highly asymmetrical. We cannot and we should not put these corridors and projects on an equal path. And I don't see a contradiction between them. I mean, I don't see a competition between Russia and China. I see a complementarity there. Now, the most important part why I see a complementarity is what I mentioned with the Northern Sea route, which will give China unique access to the Arctic, which China in itself cannot acquire. So basically, Russia is the only entry ticket for China to become Arctic nation in itself, and that means to create Arctic connectivity with the Northern Sea route, which will significantly reduce the passage and the time for transport, and will give China the missing part. That is what currently the United States have with the maritime power projection through the Indo-Pacific. Okay, maybe that is the short answer. Now, I think the question about Russia attempting a fait accompli attack on a Baltic country is important, even not only from the perspective of security in the Black Sea region, but also from the perspective of geostrategy, because there is now very vocal, a strongly vocal, group of experts pointing to such scenario, right? Pointing to a scenario that Russia might actually attack a NATO country to obfuscate the NATO Article 5, to show that Article 5 doesn't work. And I argue that this is unlikely to happen. Why? Because first and foremost, the subjugation of Ukraine, the full territorial subjugation of whole of Ukraine, is still absolutely on the agenda of Russia. So Russia has gone all in 2022 and is not going to, give up on that goal. It might postpone the goal over the years, over, let's say, the next 8-10 years, but it won't give up on this goal. And second, if we assume that Russia is successful in Ukraine, there are several options what to do. And if I were to, given the fact that I was pretty correct on the foresight about the Russian war on Ukraine, that's the way how I see it. First part is there is already ongoing war on the European security order anyway, by all means except for the use of military means, okay? So you have a full spectrum of hybrid warfare par excellence since 2022. You do not need a military attack on a Baltic country, because in the case of a military attack, you will not only get the necessary critical mass of reaction on behalf of the population within the European NATO members, but you will have to also tackle a very different response coming from these countries as a reaction to your military attack. If you stick to the ongoing, which is a Soviet playbook, by the way, and which, by the way, is what China is also using in its attack on Taiwan. It's a steady, ongoing penetration of the economic model, of the social fabric, and of the political landscape of Taiwan. It's called a death by thousand cuts. That's what China has been doing on Taiwan. That's what Russia is going to do on the European security order. And that is why I would go as a second option, following Ukraine, I would go for the unification of creating of a union with Belarus and Ukraine, installing nuclear weapons similarly to what Russia did with Belarus, and then moving forward with Moldova, with parts of Georgia, with parts of Moldova, and then increasing the speed, enhancing the intensivity of this death by thousand cuts approach on NATO. So if there is any attack on a Baltic country, then I would argue that it's going to be by non-military means. It could be a sabotage, it could be, of course, the destruction of an infrastructure, critical infrastructure. But a military attack, I would argue, would unleash a reaction on behalf of the population, especially in Central Eastern Europe, where there is still a vivid memory of what happened, during the Soviet Union time, during the First Cold War. So I would argue that it will be detrimental to the Russian interest to do so.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting. I mean, overall, I would say that all this instability potential and that uncertainty geopolitical that you kind of portrayed, of course, do not bode well for the regional connectivity projects, because you need kind of certainty to attract investment and political commitment and etc. Actually, we are running out of time. I was supposed to ask you last question about what are the main gaps in the document, but I won't ask because kind of we covered. In your answers to different questions, you kind of touched up on different weaknesses in this document. So I would conclude that there is one actually very good questions in the chat, but I'll choose one, unfortunately, because of time. If I understood correctly, it says, I think we can also end in this interesting question that yes, all those competition between different connectivity projects, what are the prospects of coordination between the EU and China? Because we have some examples in previous years that, for example, some of the projects are financed by the European financial institutions and are realized by Chinese contractors, and there's some kind of mechanisms that bring the two sides together. So are there any prospects that it's not just a 100% zero-sum game, but EU and China could somehow coordinate their moves. Again, it can be about the United States. Both the EU and China are right now trying to get their own deals with the United States, but I remember in the early days of Trump administration, there were some people were arguing that okay, now it is quite a reason that the EU and China would come together and settle their scores. And at that time in March, there were some positive signals coming from China about the EU, the sanctions and stuff. But in recent days, of course, it was all negative. So I mean, in all this context, what is the prospect of a projects, connectivity projects in the South Caucasus, be it Central Asia or in the Black Sea, that can bring together both European and Chinese stakeholders? How do you think? How do you see this prospect? Maybe we can start with Samuel and then conclude with Elena.
I mean, I think with regards to Black Sea and Central Asia, I would not expect a huge amount of convergence between EU and Chinese interest. It's clear that as a strategically autonomous corridor for goods, it does benefit both China and the EU, but I don't think the EU is particularly interested in utilizing the infrastructure and relying on critical infrastructure protection by China on this corridor. So I think that's quite important, and I think there's no sign of the EU doing that. That said, of course, a corridor can benefit two partners, despite the fact that there is some competition over the actual infrastructure development, investments, and so forth. Another thing which I think is important to mention is that, with regards to China and the EU in Central Asia, they're competing over markets to some degree. And there's also a component of critical raw materials and renewable energy where there is clear competition as well. And it's not only a competition with China. We take Kazakhstan, for example, on solar energy, where solar and hydrogen, which Kazakhstan is most predisposed for. The competition is also between it's Chinese in first place. Secondly, Saudi Arabian, UAE, and EU. Exactly. So I think there's actually quite a competitive component within that, to be frank. Within the greater scheme of things, beyond the Black Sea and the Central Asia, the EU's trade with China is about 35%. And it's clear, I totally abide by Velina's view, which is, of course, that the United States will push and pressure in every way to bifurcate. Anyone with a geostrategic understanding of the world I find it difficult to disagree with that interest-based view. However, the United States is losing dollar control. The United States is losing credibility under Donald Trump, and it's trying to not use its military prowess around the world in order to direct others to do what they want. And I don't know whether they will succeed or fail in this. I don't know if we're looking at the end of the American decades or we're looking at the continuation. I mean, this only time will tell. But I'm sure about the fact that the United States wants to bifurcate, as Velina said. And I'm also sure about the fact that they will create a lot of stumbling blocks for anyone who gets close to China, unless China totally subdues, which I doubt they will. But I have a genuine amount of doubt about the Republican administration under Donald Trump. It's true that the EU still has to toe the line and do a lot of things for the United States because we're very security dependent. But when we look at, for example, the Donald Trump policies and what it has instigated in terms of increasing the EU multi-annual financial framework budget, all of a sudden moving towards, even though it's not in full realization, strategic autonomy in different sectors, trying to have essentially policies which allow for some type of autonomy. I think this is something which we simply wouldn't have seen had it not been for the lack of credibility that the United States shows in the eyes of the EU, essentially, at this time in place. And I think then you have to go into the granular details. And of course, it's not advertised, because what would be the point of advertising it too much? It's counterintuitive then. But have a look at, what are the French and the Germans doing together on nuclear deterrence and Eurobonds? I think that's essentially where the final negotiation will lie on these things. But time will tell.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, please.
Maybe I can just add very few lines, because Sam basically outlined most of the important points on the question. And here, what comes to my mind is that for the scale of a strategic actor such as the European Union, the time of equiescence is coming to an end. But for regional actors such as Türkiye, for instance, which are also so-called swing states, right? They are still having some flexibility to operate and navigate between these bifurcating blocks. They will keep as long as possible the opportunity to oscillate. And this will create, of course, opportunities on the ground for businesses, for civilians, where we might indeed see engagement on behalf of not only European Union, but also China, United States, and so on. So I cannot exclude these short-term opportunities on the ground. For instance, when it comes to the third dimension of the Black Sea strategy, that is linked to climate-related topics, to ecological topics, to green energy. There, I wouldn't exclude actually some sort of synergy that's coming, let's say, bottom up and more organically. Of course, another layer that I would not exclude is linked to ports. We know that China is quite active and present around the world when it comes to ports network. And here again, there are certainly several Black Sea ports that will continue being open to some sort of dual investment stream. So on the one side, being, for instance, part of the European Union network when it comes to countries like Romania or Bulgaria with their ports in the Black Sea. But then again, we have also, for instance, Georgia. And Turkey is becoming, anyways, becoming a regional hub, has been one of the key hubs, for instance, and currently is the only hub for also Russian pipeline gas, but also other commodities. So again, we clearly see the opportunities. And let's not forget that geopolitics is short-term always opportunistic, because there are so many actors on the ground, both public and private, so many business opportunities. And in this kind of framework, whenever there is a demand, there will be a supply. So I don't want to be, too straightforward on the matter when I speak about bifurcation or Cold War context. Please keep in mind that this is a long-term framework, but in the short term, there will be also probably some sort of cooperation formats when it comes to technical standards, or when it comes to concrete rules or harmonization of rules. We know how important this is, and there is still a common denominator even between the European Union and China. Also, the important point of customs streamlining across all these corridors. So all in all, keep in mind that short term, all of these kind of corridors, initiatives, conflictual, to some extent conflictual interests, but also competing interests will create enormous opportunities on the ground. And probably this is the good news I would like to end up today. Opportunities, as I said, for civilians, but also opportunities for businesses and for private actors. Public actors will be put under pressure to deliver. That is why we are seeing more straightforward strategizing and the need to come up with more concrete papers that reflect the reality, even though, as I said, a little bit late, but better late than never. And that is the situation we are in. I mean, most, in my view, the best what we can take out from this situation is, of course, to keep this risk of hot war as low as possible. And I do argue that most of the public actors, both regional, public stakeholders and decision makers and institutional actors, both on regional and international level, are actually inclined into preventing any direct confrontation that might turn into a hot war.
Very interesting, actually. Very interesting topic with different facets, and I'd like to continue this discussion longer, but unfortunately we're out of time now, and we'll stop here. Just a few conclusion remarks from me that, okay, I think you would agree with me that many will depend on how financing will be found for this strategy to move forward successfully, because, in the case of the EU, it's always like no new financing mechanism, no new institutions for these kind of projects. So it will continue with existing financial frameworks. Yeah, there will be no new money. And at the same time, as far as I got from your comments, the reactions from, the role Turkey and China and the other, let's say, third-party players in the Black Sea will be very important to watch in the near future. And lastly, unfortunately, as Samuel said, many things have been added up to this paper, and Velina also said, it's not like target specific, but a lot of things have been added up, so it will be very difficult to follow and realize all those goals at the same time. So, but it's still, I think we would agree in the end of with this sentence that the existence and adoption of the paper itself is success in this stage for the EU. So let's see what will happen in the near future in its application. So thank you very, very much, Samuel and Velina, for your insightful comments and analysis. Very much appreciated. And I thank our viewers for their time, and hope to see you again in our next sessions and episodes in the future. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot to you too.